He was always the favorite, until he got arrested. Now they want me to fix it. For as long as I could remember, I lived in the penumbra of someone else's spotlight. A place not entirely dark, but one where warmth was borrowed, not earned. My parents, Robert and Elaine Callahan, had an unspoken constitution. Their love, pride, and validation were finite resources, and all of it, every last drop, had been preemptively invested in their firstborn, Julian. He was the prototype of the family ideal, a boy who learned to walk at 10 months, spoke in complete sentences before he turned 2, and by the time we were both in high school, had already amassed a trophy case that made the living room resemble a modest museum of athletic and academic perfection. The narrative was scripted before I had even discovered how to scribble my own name, and every conversation, every glance, every family gathering, whether it was Thanksgiving or a casual Sunday brunch, only reinforced the myth. Julian Callahan could do no wrong. It was a peculiar kind of invisibility I endured, not the dramatic abandonment of outright rejection, but a subtler form of erasure, like being penciled in and then lightly rubbed out so only the ghost of my existence remained. I wasn't the failure. I was worse. I was fine. I was reliable, grounded, steady, all euphemisms for unremarkable. When Julian got a C in calculus, the teacher was clearly incompetent. When I aced mine, it was, well, of course you did. You always work hard. My triumphs were digested with the politeness one reserves for a lukewarm meal. My failures, though rare, were treated as inconveniences, grating irritations that made them question why I couldn't be more like him. But I bore it all with the kind of quiet endurance you acquire when you grow up knowing love must be earned while others are simply born into it. I never asked for the pedestal, but I certainly noticed when they built it, nailed his nameplate to the top, and asked me to stand at the base holding the ladder. Julian, for his part, wore his crown with an ease bordering on arrogance. It wasn't that he was malicious, no. His superiority was more insidious. He moved through the world like someone who had only ever known a tailwind, never once questioning whether the breeze that filled his sails came at the cost of someone else rowing furiously in the shadows. He was charming, radiant even, an alchemy of charisma and confidence that made people want to believe in him, to excuse his mistakes before they even became visible to the naked eye. And mistakes he made, though no one dared call them that. The speeding tickets were youthful exuberance, the fights at frat parties, defensive reactions, and the girls who left in tears were, of course, too sensitive. I watched it all unfold over the years with the detached bemusement of someone who knew better than to protest, until the day the call came in and the world that had always forgiven him suddenly demanded something real in return. I was in my apartment when the phone rang, a small 2-bedroom unit above a bookstore, modest but wholly mine, purchased after years of saving, budgeting, and doing everything the right way. The number flashed across my screen with the eerie familiarity of a past I had long since relegated to holiday obligations and the occasional birthday message. I answered, expecting some benign inquiry or perhaps a veiled reminder to not forget Mother's Day again. But the voice on the other end didn't carry its usual breezy superiority. "Eli," my mother's voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since my grandmother's funeral. "It's Julian. He's been arrested. It's bad. There are moments in life that expand time, that stretch seconds into elongated, distorted frames, like staring through a drop of water mid-fall." Her words, once loosed into the ether, seemed to echo in the hollows of my ribcage. Arrested. The word was volcanic, erupting into a landscape so carefully cultivated to seem invincible. My initial reaction wasn't shock. It was something colder, older, an amalgam of vindication, fatigue, and a grim curiosity. Of course, I thought. Of course it had finally happened. The universe had simply tired of the pretense. But I said nothing of the sort. I listened as she rambled through the details, her voice tinged with hysteria and the brittle edge of desperation. There was something about embezzlement, a collapsed startup, investors losing money, something federal. "We don't know who else to call," she whispered, as if her admission might shatter some sacred family artifact. You've always been the responsible one." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they were the verbal equivalent of handing someone a medal after they've already been dragged through the war. Responsible. I had carried the weight of that title like a mule. Never asked to wear it, never compensated for it, just burdened with it. And now, in their hour of panic, it had become a lifeline. I could practically see the shift in their eyes, the recalibration of their hierarchy. Their golden boy had stumbled, and suddenly the scaffolding of their affection needed a new support beam. I was no longer the second choice. I was the emergency exit. I agreed to meet them, not because I owed them anything, but because curiosity burned hotter than resentment in that moment. When I arrived at their house, the same house where I had memorized every creaking floorboard and hollow wall, I was met with a tableau of crumpled perfection. My father sat hunched at the kitchen table, face buried in his hands, the lines of his usually impassive face etched deeper than I'd ever seen. My mother paced like a ghost in a loop, her fingers wringing an invisible cloth. The illusion had cracked, and they stood amidst its shards, bleeding from wounds they had never imagined they could suffer. "We talked to a lawyer," my father began, his voice hollowed out. "They said he could be looking at serious time years, unless we can negotiate some kind of deal, or restitution, or—" They looked at me then, two pairs of eyes swimming in a mix of guilt and expectancy. "You work in finance. You know people. You're the only one who can save him." It was almost laughable, the irony so sharp it could draw blood. I had built my career with no shortcuts, no family connections, no safety nets, just grueling hours, meticulous discipline, and the bitter fuel of being perennially overlooked. And now, they wanted me to deploy that carefully earned credibility to rescue the very person who had spent his life reveling in the advantages I was denied. I leaned back in the chair and surveyed them both, not with anger, but with the calm detachment of someone taking inventory before an auction. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" My mother stepped forward, her voice imploring, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We need you to help negotiate with the investors, or find a way to repay some of the money. Talk to someone. Pull some strings. You're always so good at fixing things." I wanted to laugh, or scream, or get up and walk out. But instead I sat there, absorbing the grotesque poetry of the moment. After a lifetime of being the invisible son, I was finally indispensable, not for who I was, but for what I could provide. My worth, it seemed, was still transactional. And yet, something inside me shifted, not with warmth, but with a new clarity. This wasn't an opportunity for redemption. It was a reckoning. The first movement in a symphony I intended to conduct myself. I would help, but not for them, not for Julian, for me, on my terms. And I would make sure that this time, the narrative didn't skip over my name. The morning after that fateful conversation, I stood before the mirror in my modest bathroom and barely recognized the man who stared back at me. He looked composed, his shirt pressed, his tie symmetrical, his hair combed in precise lines, but there was a sliver in his eyes. Something sharp, elusive, awake. It wasn't rage or pride or pity. It was something quieter and far more dangerous, intention. I had decided, somewhere in the hollow ache of my chest that night, that I would help, but not out of loyalty, not out of guilt, not even out of love. I would help because I wanted to see where the cracks in Julian's legend really led. I would help because power had finally shifted in my direction, and for once, I would not flinch from it. The media had already caught wind of the scandal. Julian's arrest, though not plastered across every national headline, had wormed its way into the local circuits and financial blogs, just enough to leave a stain. The words "white collar" and "fraud" danced across the news tickers, and beneath them were photos of him looking both dazed and defiant, being escorted into a courtroom in a navy suit that looked suddenly too large for his frame. I stared at those images with an unreadable expression, registering the unfamiliar sight of him in handcuffs, the shine gone from his eyes. He looked like someone just beginning to realize the currency of charm had expired. I arranged a meeting with one of the lead investors who had backed Julian's startup, a man named Leonard Keane. Keane was a war-weathered financier with a voice like gravel and the patience of a man who had been burned one too many times. I remembered seeing his name in Forbes years ago, back when I used to silently compare my trajectory to Julian's. Now I walked into Keane's office not as a hopeful admirer, but as a mediator of disaster. He didn't stand when I entered. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, scanned me like a barcode. "You're the brother?" he said, not a question, a confirmation. "I'm Eli Callahan," I replied, offering a firm handshake. "Julian's brother. Thank you for agreeing to meet." He grunted and motioned to the leather chair opposite him. "I've had 3 people try to play peacemaker since the arrest. None of them had anything useful to say. Why are you different?" I didn't flinch. "Because I'm not trying to smooth anything over. I'm not here to sell you a story. I want to understand exactly what happened and what you want." That, it seemed, earned a flicker of respect. Keen leaned back and gestured toward a thin folder on the desk. Julian had a good pitch, slick branding. A lot of us were impressed. He raised over $30 million in 2 years. We thought he was building a next-gen financial platform. What he was actually building was a sandcastle, flashy on the outside, hollow underneath. The SEC found inconsistencies in his filings. There were misappropriated funds, bonuses paid out of investor money, inflated numbers. I listened, expression neutral, absorbing the damage. Keen continued. "The worst part? He didn't just lie. He played us. Lied to our faces week after week, board meeting after board meeting. It wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "What would you need," I asked carefully, "to withdraw from pressing further charges?" Keen snorted. "Money, of course. Investors want blood or they want returns. Some are pushing for prosecution just to make an example. But if someone came forward with a real restitution plan, something that showed this wasn't a total loss, they might back off." "How much are we talking?" $8 million. That's the minimum that went missing." I exhaled slowly. $8 million was not a figure anyone just fished out of the couch cushions. But I didn't react outwardly. "Give me time," I said. "I can't promise a miracle, but I'll put together a proposal, something serious." Keen studied me. "You're not like him." "No," I said quietly. "I never was." I left the meeting with a storm brewing in my skull. The numbers haunted me like a refrain. 8 million. It would take a consortium, a miracle, or some very persuasive maneuvering. But more than that, it would take resolve. I would have to tap into every connection I had carefully built while Julian played golden boy in the press. People who trusted me precisely because I was not like him. And that trust was currency I had never planned to spend. But now, I would cash in every cent. The first person I called was Alina Wexley, a venture capitalist with a penchant for risk and a long memory. We had worked on a sustainability portfolio together 3 years prior, and though we'd never crossed into personal territory, there had been mutual respect. I laid out the situation with clinical honesty, stripping away all pretense. "You want me to help cover a fraud case for your brother?" she asked, voice skeptical but not unkind. "No," I corrected her. "I want to propose an investment vehicle that creates a bridge fund, one that buys out the restitution at a discount and leverages future equity in a spin-off product I've been developing." She paused, then chuckled darkly. "Eli, you really are the adult in the family." "I'm not doing this for him," I said. "This is a controlled burn. Either we all lose or we make something out of the ashes." She didn't answer right away, but eventually she said, "Send me the pitch deck." Over the next week, I barely slept. My days were consumed with spreadsheets, calls, pitch meetings, legal consultations. I called in favors, brokered introductions, negotiated terms so sharp they drew metaphorical blood, and slowly, a skeleton took shape, a framework that might actually work. It was insane, high risk, and entirely predicated on the idea that I could somehow turn Julian's wreckage into something marginally viable. But I wasn't asking permission. I was issuing orders. Meanwhile, Julian sat in county lockup, awaiting a bail hearing. I didn't visit him, not out of cruelty, but because I knew that any interaction would be corrosive. Our dynamic had always been lopsided, a seesaw where he sat smugly elevated while I dangled in gravity's pull. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. My parents called incessantly. My mother's messages alternated between frantic updates and emotionally manipulative sighs about how this family needs to stay together. My father was quieter, but his silences were heavier, more judgmental, like he couldn't quite believe that I hadn't solved everything already. On the 10th day, I received an email from a private investor in Seattle who wanted in on the fund I'd structured. His capital filled the final gap in the plan. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the moment marinate. I had done it. Not for glory, not for love, but for a strange, aching need to take control of the narrative I had been written out of since birth. When I finally agreed to see Julian, he looked tired. Not just physically, but existentially. The mask was cracking. He didn't smirk when I walked in. He didn't make a joke or lean back like he was in charge of the room. He just sat there, hunched in the orange jumpsuit, a shell of the man I'd grown up resenting. "You look good," he said. "You don't," I replied, taking a seat across from him. He gave a hollow laugh. "Fair." There was a silence between us that pulsed with history. Years of unspoken resentments, of unequal birthdays, of conversations that always ended with me conceding ground. But now, there was no ground to concede. He had fallen. I had not. "I heard you're helping," he said finally, his eyes searching mine. "I'm helping myself," I corrected. "And maybe, incidentally, you." "You didn't have to," he said, and I detected the faintest trace of sincerity. "No," I agreed. "But you never had to be the way you were either." He flinched at that, and I didn't soften the blow. I wanted him to feel it, to sit in the discomfort of acknowledgement. "I made a mess," he said, voice quiet. "I know that now." I leaned back and studied him. "Do you? Or do you just regret getting caught?" He didn't answer, and that, more than anything, was the answer. I stood. "There's a plan in place. You'll likely get a plea deal, reduced time, but you're going to have to cooperate, fully, no spin, no lies. You're going to tell the truth." He looked up at me, and I saw something close to humility. "I can do that," he said. I nodded once, then turned to leave. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't promise things would be okay, because they wouldn't be. Not for him, not for me, not for our family, which now felt like a brittle bridge suspended over a canyon of regret. But I would continue forward, one step at a time, because finally, the narrative was mine to write. The third week after Julian's arrest brought an unseasonal heat wave to the city, as if the atmosphere itself were conspiring to add discomfort to an already sweltering situation. The streets shimmered in the sun's unforgiving glare, and inside my apartment, every fan labored in vain against the stagnant heat. I found it oddly poetic, nature, indifferent and oppressive, mirroring the emotional landscape I now navigated. The calls from lawyers had not ceased. Neither had the whispered requests from investors seeking reassurance that the restitution fund I'd proposed was more than a bluff. I lived now in a state of relentless performance, my voice calm, my expressions measured, my arguments laced with enough gravity to keep the vultures circling but not yet diving. Beneath that veneer, though, something had begun to stir, an unease, a rising awareness that I was building something that, once constructed, would never truly belong to me. My father summoned me to the house again. He didn't ask, not directly, but his voice on the phone had that subtle timbre of assumed obedience, the way he'd always spoken to me, as if I were the extension of his will, not an entity in my own right. I nearly refused. I came close to telling him no, hanging up and severing the thread once and for all. But I didn't. Not because of obligation or duty. I went because I wanted to see how far the edifice of our family could bend before it finally collapsed. The house, with its white shutters and manicured lawn, looked almost absurd now, like a stage set left behind after the actors had been arrested. I rang the bell out of formality, though I had long since known the code to the side door. My mother answered with an exhausted smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look thin," she said, as if concern now were a suitable apology for years of disregard. "I'm fine," I replied. She ushered me into the kitchen, where the smell of oversteeped tea lingered like an old argument. My father sat at the table, flanked by manila folders and legal printouts. He didn't look up at first, as if my presence were incidental. "We got another call from the DA's office," he said flatly. "They're suggesting a 5-year minimum if Julian doesn't cooperate fully." I sat across from him, folding my hands, saying nothing. It was a tactic I'd learned in meetings. Silence can be more commanding than speech. He finally looked at me. "This plan of yours, this fund, is it real?" "Yes." "Is it working?" "It's being negotiated." He nodded, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was resignation. A man grappling with the weight of being dethroned, of realizing the son he'd invested everything in had become a liability. and the one he had ignored now held the only remaining blueprint for salvation. He didn't know how to reconcile that. I could see it in the furrow between his brows, the way his hand twitched near his coffee cup. "You know," he said after a pause, "I always thought you were too rigid, too serious. You never knew how to let things slide. Maybe that's why I never ended up in jail," I replied, more softly than he deserved. He looked at me then, properly, as if seeing me for the first time in years. "We weren't fair to you." It wasn't an apology. It was an obituary for an illusion. "No," I agreed. "You weren't." My mother reached for my hand then, and I let her, if only because part of me still needed to remember what her touch felt like when it wasn't laced with disappointment. "He was always so bright," she murmured. "Even as a baby. People were drawn to him." "I know," I said, not unkindly. "So were you." She flinched, and I immediately regretted the cruelty of the statement. But regret, I'd learned, was a luxury reserved for those who had been allowed softness. I had been given responsibility instead, dry, cold, necessary. They wanted me to visit Julian again. This time, not just as his brother, but as a proxy for their grief, their guilt, their need to believe that something about this family could still be salvaged. I agreed, but again, it wasn't for them. It was because I wanted to see if the man behind those glass walls and steel bars had changed, or if he was merely adapting his mask to suit his new environment. The detention center was the same, cold, bureaucratic, a labyrinth of procedures that stripped humanity down to ID numbers and time slots. I waited as they brought him out, and when he finally sat down across from me, I saw that jail had begun to etch its story into his skin. He looked leaner, sharper, not from discipline but from attrition. His arrogance had faded into something quieter, something dangerously close to introspection. "Hey," he said. "Julian?" I nodded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking a lot." "Good. That's about all there is to do in here." He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I used to think I could talk my way out of anything, that if I just kept moving fast enough, I'd never have to look back. And now?" He shrugged. "Now I know how long a day really is, how loud silence can be." We sat in silence for a moment, and in that stillness something passed between us. Not forgiveness, not quite, but a mutual acknowledgement of broken inheritance. "I know what I did," he said finally, "and I know I can't undo it, but I don't want you to fix it for me. Not because I deserve it, not because Mom and Dad asked. If you're doing this, let it be for you." "I am," I said. "This isn't about saving you. It's about ending the narrative." He nodded slowly, understanding. "I was good at pretending," he admitted. "Better than I thought. But it's different when you're sitting in a cell at night and there's no one left to applaud you." I studied him, trying to see the boy I used to share bunk beds with, the teenager I used to watch get everything I wanted, the man I had grown to both hate and pity. He wasn't gone entirely, but he was quieter now, diminished in a way that might, just might, lead to growth. "Your plea hearing is in 2 weeks," I said. "I'm coordinating with the investors. If they back off, you might get probation, maybe 2 years with time served, but only if you don't screw it up." "I won't," he said. And I believed him. Back in the city, the news cycle had already shifted. The headlines had thinned. New scandals had taken Julian's place, and the public, fickle as ever, had begun to forget. But the consequences lingered. The fund I'd built required meticulous oversight. The investors wanted updates, projections, audits. I was suddenly the steward of something enormous, born not out of ambition, but out of necessity. And strangely, it fit me. The weight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a shape I had always been meant to grow into. At night, I returned to my apartment and found myself staring out the window more often, watching the city pulse beneath me. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, not with the urge to jump, but with the thrill of knowing I'd climbed it by myself. The irony didn't escape me. Julian had always been the face, the name, the myth, and I, the quiet shadow, had become the architect of whatever future we still had left. My parents came by once, unannounced. They brought a pie, as if that gesture could bridge a chasm decades deep. I let them in, made tea, listened to them speak in hushed tones about how things used to be. My mother showed me old photos, as if I hadn't lived those moments myself. My father looked around the apartment with quiet approval, noting the bookshelves, the organized workspace. "You've built a good life," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I did." They didn't stay long. When they left, I didn't feel emptiness. I felt calm, like a room that had finally been aired out. The days passed, the plea hearing approached, and in the quiet moments between strategy calls and investor reports, I found myself wondering what I would do when it was all over. Not the story, that would never end, but this chapter, the fire, the reckoning, the long-delayed reversal of power. When the dust settled, who would I be? Not just the brother who cleaned up the mess, not the second son turned savior. I wanted more than that, needed more, and so I began to write, not to publish, not for acclaim, but for myself. A record, a reclamation. I wrote about growing up invisible, about learning to hold silence like armor, about the aching complexity of family, the way love could wound more deeply than hate. And as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me, an old grief finally given form. I was not done. Julian's path was still uncertain. My family was still a web of unfinished conversations. But I had found the first sentence in a story that was finally mine to tell. Absolutely. Harem. By the time the leaves turned brittle and orange, the story that had once gripped our family like a vice was beginning to loosen its hold. The plea hearing for Julian was scheduled for the second week of October, and with every passing day the emotional architecture I had built around myself, brick by painstaking brick, began to feel more permanent, more legitimate. No longer temporary scaffolding to hold up someone else's collapsing legacy, but something solid, mine. The investors were still involved, but the tone of our conversations had shifted. They now addressed me with deference, consulted me not merely as a necessity but as an authority. It was not lost on me that their tone had changed the moment Julian's name started appearing in headlines next to mine, not as the golden child, not as the empire's architect, but as a cautionary tale. Reputation, it turned out, could be reshaped if you knew the right angles to press. The night before the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror for longer than usual, not out of vanity, but contemplation. My reflection no longer felt like a stranger I had to convince of my worth. The circles under my eyes told the story of nights spent negotiating, writing, rebuilding. The lines near my mouth, newer now, had come from speaking truths I once swallowed whole. The silence I had carried for decades had finally unspooled, and in its place came words, clear and unflinching. I would stand before the court not as a witness, not as a loyal brother, not even as a son seeking validation. I would stand as a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows of familial mythology. Julian looked almost human in the courtroom, stripped of the slick armor of wealth and charm, clothed in a plain gray suit that made him indistinguishable from any other defendant. The judge was a woman in her 60s, firm-eyed and direct. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as she took her seat and called the hearing to order. My parents sat 2 rows behind me. My mother's hands were clenched, pale and trembling in her lap, while my father sat rigid, his jaw set like stone. There was no illusion left between us now, only the slow, public culmination of everything they had never wanted to acknowledge. When Julian was asked to rise and speak, he did so with the restraint of someone who had finally accepted that he no longer controlled the narrative. He did not offer excuses. He didn't lean on charm or blame bad influences or flawed systems. Instead, he said something that made even the court stenographer pause in her typing for half a beat. "I used to think I was immune to consequences," he said. "I was wrong. I hurt people. I lied. I stole time, money, and trust. And the worst part is, I did it because I thought I could. I thought people like me didn't get punished, that people like my brother would always be there to clean it up. I was wrong again." A hush followed those words, one that felt earned rather than dramatic. The judge studied him with the scrutiny of someone trying to discern sincerity from performance. And when she finally passed her judgment, it landed with the weight of something not just lawful, but righteous. "Mr. Faulkner," she said, "you are hereby sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months, contingent on continued cooperation and restitution compliance. Court is adjourned." Just like that, the verdict came down. Clean, simple, but seismic. As they led Julian away, he turned to me. His mouth moved silently, forming the words, "Thank you." I nodded, but didn't follow. My part was done. The rest was his to carry. Outside the courtroom, my parents stood waiting, like two statues weathered by seasons they never thought they'd live to see. My mother reached for me again, the same way she had after his arrest, and again I let her, not out of obligation, but because some rituals lose their sting when performed with clear eyes. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said, her voice breaking. "You would have figured it out," I replied gently. "Or maybe you wouldn't have. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility. My father met my gaze then, and there was no trace of the aloof disapproval that had once defined him. Just quiet reckoning." "He's lucky you're his brother," he said. "No," I said. "He's lucky I finally learned I didn't have to be." I left them standing there and walked away, not as a child dismissed, but as a man choosing his exit. In the weeks that followed, something curious happened. The calls from the press dwindled. The inquiries about the fund were replaced with proposals for new ventures, ones where my name came first. Former colleagues reached out, not with apologies, they were too proud for that, but with opportunities, as if they suddenly remembered that I'd always been in the room. I turned most of them down. Not because I held grudges, but because I no longer needed the validation. I had other plans. The fund, once a mechanism for crisis control, became a structure for real accountability. Victims received their reparations, some through direct settlements, others through structured investments that would grow over time. I hired a team, not just of lawyers and accountants, but counselors, advisors, advocates. The kind of people Julian never thought to include. I made sure their salaries reflected the weight of the work. It became something bigger than him, bigger than the scandal. It became a model. I moved apartments. The new place was smaller, tucked into an older building with creaky floors and big windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made even the dust look poetic. It had a narrow study with built-in shelves and a writing desk that overlooked a quiet street. I didn't take any photos of my family with me. Instead, I framed letters, notes from people whose names I hadn't known until they reached out to thank me. A single sentence from a woman whose retirement fund had vanished under Julian's scheme stood out. "You reminded me that justice doesn't always wear a robe." I read that line every morning. Julian wrote from prison. The first letter was stiff, formal, as if he were trying on accountability like a suit that hadn't been tailored yet. The second was warmer. By the third, he spoke openly, about therapy, about guilt, about a childhood neither of us had fully understood until now. I wrote back, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. Not to mend what had broken, but to acknowledge that it had, and that something new could grow in its place. My parents visited him every month. They told me about it sometimes. They still hoped he'd turn a corner, build a new kind of life after release. I didn't discourage them. Hope, I had learned, was not inherently dangerous. Only when it obscured truth did it become a threat. One autumn afternoon, about a year after the sentencing, I stood on the edge of a quiet park, watching children play on the swings. I wasn't thinking about Julian. I wasn't thinking about restitution funds or board meetings or newspaper headlines. I was thinking about how I had no one's shadow to live under, no expectation to fulfill except my own. A woman passed by walking a dog, nodded at me, smiled. Just a simple gesture. But it reminded me that anonymity could be its own kind of peace. I didn't need to be the hero of a redemption arc. I didn't need to be the son who fixed everything. I had already done what needed to be done, and now I could simply exist. I took out my phone, scrolled past unread emails, and opened a blank document. A new idea had been forming, one unrelated to my family, unrelated to trauma. A story that was mine from the very first sentence. I began to write. This time, no one would laugh. This time, no one would ask me to save them. This time the narrative was entirely mine, and that was enough.